Good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us for our weekly webinar ahead of the bank holiday weekend. It's been a particularly sobering week this week as we found out the UK's got the greatest mortality rate outside of the US, the greatest in Europe. We also learned more about the disproportionate impact of COVID on certain ethnic and demographic groups. There's obviously many theories about why this is the case for both of those things. But as we've seen in previous episodes of this webinar, it's inescapable that the NHS has changed hugely in response to this the virus since it hit our shores. Time will tell whether these changes have been the right ones, but today we are looking in detail at the role innovation has played in the response to COVID, both good, bad, and ugly. So this week we are joined by Phil Webb, Head of Value-Based Healthcare at Mtech, and Tony Cambridge, who's a lead biomedical scientist in Plymouth Hospitals. Both huge amounts of experience in innovation, particularly all related to the COVID stuff. So again, without further ado, we will move straight on to Phil, if we can do. Your day job is looking at innovation, really. So could you just summarise for us what stand out as the highlights for you of how the NHS has responded to COVID?
Thanks, Tom. So the main thing that I've noticed is the speed at which things have been progressing and how quickly you can actually get something done from nothing to actually get something delivered. So in Mtech and Morgannwg, we've done probably 3 things that outside of COVID would have probably taken us about 5 or 6 years to actually go through our governance process. So the 3 things we managed to implement, and this is all in the space of about 4 to 5 weeks, is we've now established a 3D printing hub. So I'm sat in the unit where the 3D printing hub is sat because we just had a review and looking at what we're actually printing. We've managed to work with one of our partners to create a virtual assistant to provide general advice for COVID-19 using artificial intelligence. And we've also developed quite rapidly in the space of 5 weeks a brand new test and way of diagnosing COVID-19 through something called LAMP. All of these things would have required massive research efforts and projects which would have probably taken a long period of time and about 5 to 6 years to actually get anywhere. And we have managed to achieve these in 4 weeks. So there's an unprecedented level of change that the COVID situation has allowed us to do in a really short space of time.
Can you just give us a little bit of an insight into what the things are that's enabled that change?
So there's 3 main components to this. The first one is leadership. So our permissions level has gone down to a level at which people are empowered to actually do something themselves. So previously in the NHS, you'd have had to write a board paper or a governance paper, and you'd have to run it through the entire governance cycle, which takes months to do, before you could even get to the stage of about actually doing anything. So people are now much more trusting of you doing something and not asking for permission, but potentially asking for forgiveness if it goes wrong later on. So that's the first thing that's changed. And then the second thing that's changed is, as a consequence of that, people just feel more empowered to do things. So people are just going out and doing stuff now and not worrying about what would the board say, what would this committee say, what would that committee say. And we're getting really rapid implementation of things to the point where our 3D printer is now practically producing things that are actually being used.
And what kind of things is that being used for?
Everything from PPE to door handles to dental implants to anything that we do. We're actually going to be printing off a brand new probe to use with a LAMP test because we've got the design template from USW and we're printing it in a material that's non-fluorescent in the LAMP mixture. So, this from a manufacturing perspective would have involved USW talking to a manufacturer and having a process and using quite a lot of money to get a mold done. We're printing these probes off now. So the print run that I've just done on the prototype has just printed off 50 probes in the space of about 3 hours. And we would never have got there through the old way of working with a manufacturer to go through a whole governance process on standards. And what it's also allowed us to do is identify areas which allows us to fast track things. So you don't need CE marking if you're using your product internally, which opens up a whole range of things that we can do that we could have never done in the time period because you have to go through a whole process of manufacturing standards.
Yeah, very interesting. And how many of those things that you are printing were you planning to, or how much of that sort of workload were you planning to do, and how much of it is a direct response to sort of
So we knew
necessity?
3D printing would revolutionise dental work and oral max fax work just because of the nature of reconstruction surgery and dental implants. What we didn't realise is how quickly it is to produce pragmatic solutions of things like CPAP interface. Right? So we 3D printed things that allow our CPAP machines to actually better fit patients based on just re-engineering some designs and printing them off in 2.5 hours. So we can mass produce at scale things using 3D printing that we would never have done before. All our insulin pumps and infusers are now working because bits had fallen apart on the machines and we were waiting for manufacturer supply chain to replace them, right? That tail time was about 3 months. We can print those in half a day. So all our infusion pumps are now working because we 3D printed the part that was missing.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, thanks very much, Phil. So Tony, just coming over to you now. I mean, throughout this series, we promised that testing was going to be one thing we'd stay away from because it's been all over the news, but it's so relevant in terms of the innovation piece. Could you just give us a bit of an overview of what have been the positive elements of the NHS and the global healthcare response to COVID in terms of sort of the innovation around testing?
Yeah, first, without going too far into what positivity can come out of such a horrible situation, but some of those relationships are now being established or improved between the NHS and manufacturing, and NHS and the diagnostics companies, communication links between different organisations that can mobilise responses. The one thing we've got to learn from this terrible episode is we need to ramp up contingency plans at the earliest opportunity, and I don't think they truly existed. Lots of work being put into what's gone well, what are the learning opportunities from such a pandemic like this, and what the healthcare response needs to be, and which organisations and communities need to be working together. But I don't think those relationships have been stronger between the NHS. One thing that has also been great, but also a little bit limiting, is the weight that some of the NHS trusts and some of the laboratories that need to be doing the testing have had to go through to get really specific guidance, and guidance that we have full faith in, that doesn't change on a day-to-day basis. So where you're talking Public Health England, NHS England, the directives coming out of there and the control that they've needed to put in place around the testing, that has felt a little bit disjointed, with a little bit of prioritization going on within the allocation of tests to certain sites based on what is perceived as the clinical need. So yeah, manufacturing, again, that's another area. We've seen lots of retooling going on and repurposing of manufacturing plants to ramp up PPE, for instance, ventilators, other healthcare items that become essential. But what we are seeing as well is there is far too much reliance within the UK on global manufacturing sort of plants and global diagnostics companies. And I think that's a real learning point for us to move forward, is how can we make sure we have more control within the UK over our own activities.
Yeah, okay, that's a really interesting point that's come out of Phil's response as well. Do you think that's going to prompt more collaborative working on a local level within this country or across the 4 nations?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is pockets of real success, and the only way to build a successful network beyond that is to replicate it. So yeah, you'll have lots of companies coming forward offering their support, but is that logistically sound way forward? So I think now is a time for reflection. We're going to be stuck with COVID for many months, maybe years, maybe forever. It's how we approach that. Who is having those discussions, holding those talks, what clinical input is going into those talks, as well as the logistical input, because I think we've all got slightly different says across the UK, especially between populated and lower populated areas, which have tracked way behind the big cities, certainly in the southwest. we're tracking way behind other more populous areas and haven't seen our waves yet. So in order to be ready for those second or third waves based on maybe a relaxation of lockdown, yeah, we need to be prepared, but that guidance needs to be absolutely clear, and there needs to be a strategy in place that has good science behind it.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you mentioned about those sort of successful collaboration. What would you see, could you give us 3 of the main ingredients for successful collaboration in terms of the innovation piece between the NHS?
Yeah, I think Phil's touched on it there with leadership and ownership. Those are absolutely integral to having a very sleek operation, gaining information from the right areas, following the right science. But there's always a bit of a lag in terms of the information and the data that is coming out. And unfortunately, what we've seen is an eagerness to get solutions, pretty much overnight, which we might come on to a bit later in this webinar, that has introduced what I would describe as additional risk. In terms of elements that have been successful and need to remain in place is flexibility of the NHS workforce and key workers. I mean, some people have gone above and beyond. They've completely upturned their working lives in line with their social lives, their personal lives. How sustainable that is in the long run remains to be seen. So we need to have an approach to taking, the workforce into consideration. They're putting themselves at risk on a day-to-day basis. We've taken measures, and across the whole of the UK, taken measures to split teams and have reduced workforces who don't come into contact, and basically preserve, the ability to deliver services. And that needs to remain for some time, even after a lockdown, because there is that potential wave of additional infections that we need to deal with. One thing was protecting the critical care provision and any surge. We've not seen the level of surge in certain areas of the country that we were anticipating. That's not to say that it's not going to appear later on in this year, an ongoing challenge, really.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And I mean, we'll pick it up in it now, actually. I think you mentioned sort of about the expansion of testing capacity, and it's no secret to anyone listening that has been a challenge. Sort of with that in mind, and other things within your role, what are the bad and the ugly bits around innovation, and particularly around the implementation that you've seen recently?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, there was an eagerness to have a solution, and there was a flooding of the market in terms of the different devices, IVDs coming to market, very, very quickly released with CE marks, with FDA emergency use approvals. Now, the FDA have been very clear very recently that these aren't approvals to implement these IVDs long term. They still have to go through the usual approval process. And with any CE marked IVD, there's a huge amount of verification and validation that needs to be undertaken. That, in my mind, looking at the data that is produced by these IVD companies, the data has been lacking. They're using, some spiked samples, for instance. They're using known negatives and very small pools of tests that we wouldn't, or numbers and samples that we wouldn't normally consider as being statistically valid or giving you absolute assurance of the performance characteristics of that IVD. Normally, we would take a lot of time about clinical ranges, for instance, the action levels, the clinical action levels that are important in putting a test into place. So I'm not really sure that's taking place, and it just puts more, the more choice you've got, it almost clouds your judgment a little bit. And we've looked at some of the performance criteria, and the MHRA has come out for, say, lateral flow antibody tests and said 98% specificity, 98% sensitivity is what they should be aiming for, which discounted pretty much 98%, I think, of the IVDs that had been released rapidly. We've now got a move towards potential antibody testing, but we don't know whether that's a population sample we'll be doing and testing a percentage of the community, or whether or not it will be a wholesale test everybody. I've done a bit of a calculation, for our local population here in Plymouth, and it would take us about 4 months to do the entire population with a couple of analyzers running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then we don't even know if immunity is established. So again, those are discussions being held within NHS England directly with diagnostics companies, and they will control the distribution of those tests anyway. So a lot of that decision making has been taken out of our hands, although referring back to what Phil was saying, we have been able to move forward with procurement. Obstacles have been removed. We've been able to say what we need. We've been listened to, and that has led to implementation earlier than it would have taken normally.
Brilliant. And you've mentioned something there just towards the end that our listeners may or may not be aware of, but certainly me in my work with the primary care network have come across that there are certain things that there's been that central control seized over things like testing PPE, which maybe wouldn't already be there in England. Has that had positive, negative, or sort of no particular impact on how you run your business? Well, I'll come to you, Phil, on that first if you can. Yeah. Oh.
I'm unmuted. So my good, the bad, and the ugly is two general things that this is exposed. Okay, British engineering and British science used to be the envy of the world, right? COVID's exposed us badly. That none of those two things are true anymore, and it can't continue like that. So that's a general perspective. I don't think centralisation for this works, and the reason why it doesn't work is that it's got to be adapted into your particular environment. We've been having platforms sent to us that we can't actually use because it serves no purpose for what we're trying to achieve on testing. Yeah, they've been sent to us quite clearly labelled for research and non-diagnostic purposes, and they've been given to us because of the pragmatic balance between getting good testing capacity up and doing the right thing with the right test, and those aren't the same things. Yeah, so it's caused us as many problems as it's solved, not having local control about what it is that we're doing for our localities. Centralisation tends to force things on us that don't actually work in the way that we want it to work, or for the strategy that we're trying to implement. So there is no point in massively increasing RT-PCR strategy when it takes, at the moment, 5 days to actually use the platforms that we currently have in place in Public Health Wales, because actually 5 days is too long a period to get a test result back to anyone. Yeah, which allows us to make we have to make local decisions about things like LAMP. You get a LAMP test result back in half an hour. So if you can validate against real samples, not spike samples, with real COVID patients, what you actually find is test performance varies depending on what cohort you're testing. So if you're testing an inpatient patient load with known severe symptoms and high viral load, you're going to get really good results on sensitivity and specificity, because guess what? They've got high.
Don't know if we've lost Phil. Tony, I think Phil's just dropped out for a second there. So can I just come to you and picking up on Phil's point there about the centralisation and stuff and how that's impacted you?
Yeah, I think going back to an earlier point I made about the communication, I think the government were very quick to come out with a very loose strategy on the testing side of things, and they were just being reactive to the demands of the media. The public obviously wanted to know what the approach was going to be. When were we going to come out of this? And I think just making those announcements as early as they did around the tests which require swabbing, so the PCR tests, and then the emergence of the antibody testing, either that being a point of care test or now automated in the laboratory. What we are looking at is, we're trying to unpick that now. We're waiting for that further information, but one of the things that stood out to me, and I've been quite vocal about, is that this arbitrary 100,000 tests that the government announced, early in April or end of March for the end of April, there wasn't a lot of science behind that. the capacity was within the laboratories. We were able to and had the teams and the analyzers to produce that volume of tests across the country. What we didn't have was a supply chain of reagents or extraction buffers. And those teams have gone to huge, they've made moves basically to, disrupt their working patterns, running 24/7 within microbiology labs, which doesn't always happen. There's usually an on-call system. And then, basically, I've got real concerns about these posted, swab collection kits that are going out to people in their homes, because if anybody's seen a video or experienced a swab of the nasal cavity being taken, you're talking about 7 centimeters to the back of your nasal cavity, having a good scrape around to get cells and all sorts, to get enough viral load. You cannot tell me that Joe Public is sitting at home receiving these swabs and then performing that correctly. So our capacity to generate accurate results and give us assurance that there isn't any risk around false negatives or even false positives, that is a real issue for us, because it's just eating into the capacity of testing. A trained professional taking those swabs would have a higher hit rate on accurate results than posting out 40,000 of your 100,000 tests. So that's where I've got a real problem with having these arbitrary targets. It should be clinically directed. Yes, people can be asymptomatic or have very mild symptoms, but the testing protocol needs to be directed, and the testing, or at least the sampling of nasal swabs and throat swabs, needs to be done by a healthcare professional, and trained phlebotomists need to be taking the bloods for antibody testing rather than finger prick tests at home, while we've got this uncertainty about the performance of those IVDs.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. So Phil, you're back. I think that's the NHS Wi-Fi.
Well, it's another demonstration. So we're running the NHS of infrastructure that actually doesn't work in a modern world, right? So forget about everything that we're trying to do for COVID. We can't even do basic things like get connectivity done and sort that properly.
Yeah, we need to fix that first and foremost, definitely. So Tony's just sort of given us a bit more on sort of what he's seen around, picking up on your previous points. Just coming back to you, Phil, what do you think, in terms of everything that's been going on, what do you think the NHS has learned from the last few months about how to innovate, and how do you think it will affect innovation and the risk appetite going forward?
So I think there's two sides of this. So we now know that we can do things really quickly, and by really quickly I mean really quickly. Yeah. I've just been down at the 3D printing hub. If you came here 4 weeks ago, there'd be nothing there. We have now got over 10 printers, printing stuff that clinicians are actually using. 4 weeks. Yeah, we didn't know that we could do that. We've published a chatbot publicly in 3.5 weeks. Right, that's unheard of. I've been working on virtual assistants for a long time. It usually takes about 3.5 years to go through everything. Okay, 3 weeks and we've got a publicly available chatbot.
And what does that chatbot do? Just for our audience.
So Kerry provides general advice and staff advice on COVID-19. So non-clinical advice, but practical things like how do I actually isolate at home? And it's been written by people who've gone through COVID. So it's really practical advice. Yeah, things about washing. So how do I kill COVID? What detergent should I use? Yeah. So anything above 56 degrees centigrade, lyses the virus. Okay. Most detergents lyse the virus. Things like not everyone does have a washing machine. So how do you wash in a sink? Really practical stuff. So we now confident that we can do stuff. Right. I'm now confident that I can print in a variety of different materials, that I'm not relying on manufacturers to provide me with parts, and whole pieces of equipment. So you'll know this because it's happening, is people are retro engineering CPAP and ventilators, redesigning them and then printing them off with a 3D printer. We've just done our own version of this here. The challenge to the manufacturing industry is, if I can prove and have confidence I can do this myself, why would I need manufacturers to work with me anymore? That's what the real challenge is now, which is there's loads of stuff that I'd be reliant on a manufacturer to work with me. I'm not reliant on a manufacturer to do that anymore. And you know what? I can use it in my own population without a CE mark. The balance is the safety aspect versus the speed at which I can now do things myself. And I think that's the bit that we're going to find out over the next 6 to 12 months, what that balance actually is.
So do you think it will be looking at the outcomes of all of these innovations will determine what the risk appetite is? And if things have gone well, then people will say, yeah, we can do that. We'll crack on and do things quickly. And if they don't go so well, maybe there'll be a bit of a reversion to type around a more...
Yeah, what I think it's going to cause in the NHS is the old world versus the new normal. And there's a lot of very senior people in my organisation saying that the new normal is what we're doing now. But there's still a lot of people in my organisation saying, no, we revert back to type as soon as this is all over, because this was a blip. The reality is that COVID is going to stay in our population forever. We're going to have to deal with it like we do with flu. Yeah. But what it's exposed is that things like, why don't you trust your people to work from home? Yeah. Why do you want to control what everyone is doing to the point where they do nothing? Yeah. All these things are now being challenged to say, if you don't like what yesterday was, and you do like the way that today and the future looks like, yeah, how do we stop us reverting back to an apathy position where we just go back to what we did before? And that's going to cause a lot of tension in the NHS.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That innovation isn't just the tech, is it? It's ways of working, it's mindset, and everything else as well. So Tony, just coming to you, I suppose the same question as well. What do you think the NHS has learned about how to innovate and what it mean going forward?
Well, first off, I echo everything that Phil's just said about trusting employees to be able to produce valuable work while they're working from home. We're certainly looking at similar measures. You know, how do we continue as this is the new normal? Certainly looking for the next 6 months at the very least in working in the same way as we are now. But again, we're going back to the grassroots. You know, how are GPs wanting to, you know, hold those consultations with the patients? You know, there's quite a lot of vocal GPs out there saying, yes, we need to continue with virtual consultations, but we need to survey all those non-vocal GPs out there who maybe are not quite so comfortable with that. That's certainly led to a significant downturn in the amount of work coming to the clinical laboratory, which has allowed us to do the split working setup of having half of our staff working from home and half in doing the analytical work. And that's allowed us to prepare better for accreditation, for quality management processes, which are, you know, there are huge commitments to generating evidence for assessors, UCAS and other, against ISO standards. And we're finding it difficult to fit that into the working day when, you know, literally we have very little demand management around the work coming in. I know there's been some impact on cancer services and 2-week waits and referrals. What we want to make sure is that the new normal doesn't create minefields of the future, you know, that we're not stopping patients from going and seeking those face-to-face consultations where lumps can be felt, you know, symptoms can be really explored with the patient face-to-face, because that's just going to cause us headaches in the future and poorer patient outcomes and more pressure on acute services. So we've designed off-site hubs for antenatal, for instance, phlebotomy, cancer services, minor injury. They've all gone off-site. That is a model that we need to look at in the future, because patients are finding, you know, we're getting the feedback that is more accessible. They don't have the problems with parking and paying for parking at hospitals in England. So we've got to take a holistic approach, really. We've got to survey not only the clinicians and the practitioners, but also, you know, what do the patients want? What's their expectations in the future? And if they have been a patient during this period, what have they found positive about their interactions with their clinical support, and what can be improved? Only then will we know what the future might hold in terms of a new normal.
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. That's great, Tony, and I think a very fitting message to end on. I think we're out of time for this week. So Tony and Phil, thanks both very much for your input and insight today. Really valuable stuff. Thank you everyone at home for attending. Next week we're going to look at strategic procurement and medicines management. Following weeks we're going to be looking at the changing face of care delivery from both a hospital perspective and a primary care perspective. Then on June the 5th we're looking to run an hour-long Q&A session, inviting questions from you to a panel that will hold on the day. So we'll be asking for questions in advance if you give some thought to that. But for now, please enjoy your bank holiday, give some extra thought to our NHS colleagues that will be working tomorrow, and we will see you next week. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.